știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce-nseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a
Right, there we go. Bit of a problem with the sound there. So yes, I'll just repeat myself here. This is the latest in our series on the selected works of Stalin from the 1920s, which is entitled "On the Opposition," and we are looking today at second the second. Uh, piece of work from there, which is entitled Reply to the Discussion on the Report of the Social Democratic Deviation in Our Party. Right, hang on. Right, well, there very much should be sound now, as I can see it coming through. But yeah, it looks like the mic was muted at the beginning of the stream, so it's on now. So we are looking today at the second part of the discussion at the CPSU conference or Congress in the late period of 1926. To be more precise, it's November 1926 when this is taking place. And what we see here in this particular document is that this is very much the beginning of the end for Trotsky in particular, but also Zinoviev and Kamenev. And what we see, particularly at the end of Stalin's reply to the discussion, is that Trotsky is on his way out of the party for reasons that we will go into in just a moment. So we'll begin by looking at the major issues here which Stalin is covering. And we covered a lot of these in the last one, because this is, of course, Stalin's replies to the discussion. And what the argument revolves around is four principal areas. So, one, whether it is possible to build socialism in one country. And that is, of course, one of the major points of dispute between ourselves as Marxist-Leninists and the Trotskyites to this day. Secondly, whether the Bolshevik Party held the point of view or shared Trotsky's point of view, which is that that of the permanent revolution. Thirdly, the role of the peasantry in the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Revolution, and fourthly, well, what constitutes a faction and what doesn't, and what does factional behavior constitute. Now, we'll start off with where Stalin starts, where he's replying to Zinoviev, and he's replying to Zinoviev and Zinoviev's contributions in this Congress, because there is an argument between Stalin and Zinoviev in this case over what the international nature of the revolution should be. And Zinoviev, following Trotsky, starts talking about the fact that to believe that there could be a victory for socialism in one country goes against the writings of Marx and Engels. And to back up his case, Zinoviev starts quoting from Engels' Principles of Communism from 1847. Now, if you're not familiar with it, the Principles of Communism is the preparatory document in many respects for the Communist Manifesto, which appeared a year later in 1848. And in this, Engels talks about the fact that the proletarian revolution will succeed rapidly in the advanced industrialized countries, and it'll succeed in one of those and be rapidly followed by the others, and will have to be rapidly followed by the others. Now, this, of course, causes a dispute in the Bolsheviks, because some, like Zinoviev is in this Congress, cling in a very dogmatic fashion to this formula, without realizing, as Stalin correctly points out, that there is a world of difference between what Engels is writing about in 1847 and what the Russian communists are dealing with, or I should say the Soviet communists are dealing with in 1926, nearly 100 years later. See, and what Stalin says in reply to Zinoviev is that what he and the Trotsky and others had failed to take into account is that the change in the nature of capitalism from 1847 up to the end of the 19th century is one where you move from the period of free competition, as Lenin put it, to the period of imperialism. And that changes very much the whole game with the nature of our analysis of what is possible in terms of building socialism in one country. And why is that? And Stalin goes into why Engels' formula from 1847 has to be replaced with Lenin's formula from, as early as like 1905, but particularly from 1915 onwards. Because what happens in that period between 1847 and 1915 is that you enter into the imperialist period in the advanced capitalist countries. So Britain, France, the unified Germany, and the United States in particular, but also Italy to a degree, Japan to a degree as well. And what that means is that you go from a situation where the advanced countries, and especially those such as Britain and the United States, were in that early period in the 1840s, were regarded as, by Marx and Engels in the 1840s, as having it possible for those countries to go through a rapid proletarian revolution in an almost peaceful manner, to being countries where that very much would not be possible. Now, I'll relate this back to the Soviet experience in just a moment, but to go into this, because this is a big part of the argument between Stalin and Zinoviev. Zinoviev continues to push the idea that there must be a revolution that breaks out in the advanced countries for it to be possible for the Russian Revolution to survive. And part of that is this discussion of what would be possible in the advanced countries. In the 1840s and early 1850s, Marx makes the point that in the United States and in Britain, there was minimal bureaucratization of the state. There wasn't a hardcore embedded militaristic clique in either country, like there was in France, like there would be later in Germany. And to a certain point, that claim that Marx and Engels were to make in the 1840s was correct when it came to Britain, and also to the United States. The amount of centralized military bureaucracy in the United States prior to the American Civil War was minimal. The amount of which that existed in Britain was also minimal. In fact, there was the standing British Army prior to two key events that were to happen in the later 1850s, which are the First Indian War of Independence and the Crimean War. Prior to those events, the military development of Britain was still mainly based on its navy, not on its standing army. There was a huge army in the Napoleonic Wars, for instance, but that was dispersed and disbanded rapidly afterwards. The actual British army in the 1840s and 1850s was still relatively small. There was a large army that belonged nominally to the East India Company that was used for the extraction of wealth from India, but that wasn't formally anyway part of the British Army. It was nominally a private army run by British officers. Of course, the East India Company and the British state were interwoven together. But it wasn't until the mutiny against the company rule in India, the First Indian War of Independence, and the Crimean War, which caused a fundamental change in British military history. Because what that revealed was that they couldn't simply just rely on the on company rule in India, because that had seen this gigantic uprising of the East India Company soldiery against their British officers. And secondly, in the Crimean War, how appallingly badly the very amateurish aristocratic officer corps performed, even though the British nominally won that war, the British and the French, against an even worse organized Russian forces. But the sublime incompetence of the British officers that led to, of course, the charge of the Light Brigade charging the Russian cannons with light cavalry, that worked out well, and the war being so badly handled, and so many casualties, both wounded and killed, being racked up by the British, that there was, for the first time in that period, a widespread anti-war movement emerged, which led to the British government having to professionalize its officer corps. Because prior to that, one of the things that used to happen in Britain was that certain landowners and aristocrats could essentially not only purchase for themselves an officer's commission, but also run their own private regiments. Like the man who ran the Light Brigade, Lord Cardigan, he'd paid for the regiment, paid for this regiment himself. He dressed them according to his own bizarre standards. He paid for the uniforms, the weaponry, the horses, etc. And there was a lot of examples of that. He was just the most prominent because he led his men to disaster and defeat in that charge of the Light Brigade. Now, the change necessitated by those two disasters in the 1850s led to a much more extensive military bureaucracy, and that in Britain, and that coincides with the move into the imperialist period. And in the imperialist period, you saw a vast expansion of the military bureaucracy in Britain, and also an expansion of the standing army. And this was again compounded by the very, very negative performance of the British Army in the two Boer Wars in the later 1890s, early 1900s. So by the time you come up to 1914, Britain has become much more militarized, much more bureaucratic. And the same goes for the United States. The United States, prior to the Civil War, did have a sort of centralized federal army. But what was revealed by the Civil War was that this was not particularly powerful. And in the early part of the Civil War, it took them a long time to build a federal army that could actually beat the rebellious armies of the Confederate States. After the Civil War, what lasted from that was that the federal government became much more powerful. And in the way in which the historical process and the contradictions play out, you go from this period where the federal government defeating the slaveholders and being able to enforce federal law across the different states. That went from being a progressive development in terms of the defeat of the slaveholders, the defeat of the slaveocracy and their rebellion, to being a reactionary force, because of course you then have the United States go into the imperialist period, and it starts to use this federal armed force to impose the rule of the U.S. ruling class and the will of the U.S. ruling class over areas like Cuba and the Philippines and Haiti and other places in Central America, South America, the Caribbean, etc., that the U.S. ruling class wanted to dominate. And so again, by the time we get to 1914-15, the situation has developed in a completely different way than the way it was looked at by Marx and Engels in the midpoint of the 19th century. See, that's the way in which the historical process twists and turns. You can't just take a formula that Engels and Marx used in the 1840s and 1850s and try to apply it to like the 1920s. And so this also points out like why reformism is so utterly wrong and nonsensical, because they in the later 1950s started taking this formula of Britain as this great democratic country without this militarist clique running it, Well, there'd been a militarist clique running it since we went into the imperialist period. Now, the reason why there's this back and forth over this is between Stalin and Zinoviev is because, of course, Zinoviev insists that Engels' formula from 1847 has to be stuck to, which is that there needs to be revolutions in the advanced countries. Stalin not only points out that, according to Engels' list of objectives of the of the proletarian revolution, listed at the end of Principles of Communism, that not only has 9 out of 10 of those been achieved in the early Soviet Union, but also that by trying to cling dogmatically to the words of Engels from 1847, Zinoviev and Trotsky and others in the opposition bloc had neglected the most crucial elements of Marx and Engels' teaching, which is they're teaching a method, not a dry and abstract bunch of text that needs to be religiously stuck to. That's the point that Stalin is making here. And also, he goes on to talk about why Lenin's discovery of the development of the understanding of the uneven development of the capitalist world is so crucial, because what turned out to happen was that the advanced industrial countries weren't the first to be conquered by a proletarian revolution. It was backward Tsarist Russia that was first, followed by, of course, semi-feudal China later in 1949. And it's the uneven development of these countries of the world that actually lends strength to the idea that socialism can be achieved in one country. So the very weakness of Tsarist Russia, the very weakness and poor inability of the Russian bourgeois to develop capitalism or even to dismantle the autocracy actually strengthens the hand of the socialist revolution. And then we get into a discussion of whether there can be a revolution, a successful socialist revolution in such a backward country as Tsarist Russia. And what Stalin points out is that the opposition are deliberately ignoring the subtleties of this. See, also that Lenin said quite clearly from 1915 onwards that a socialist revolution could succeed in Tsarist Russia, but the Trotskyites routinely take this debate and distort it. See, what Stalin's saying here is that a socialist revolution is not only possible, it is being achieved in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, but that it does not have an absolute guarantee of victory. There is not an absolute guarantee against capitalist restoration. There is not an absolute guarantee that the reactionary forces of the imperialist states won't stage some kind of intervention. See, there's a world of difference between saying that we can start to build socialism in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, and that we can successfully start to do that. There's a world of difference between arguing that and arguing that that means that there's going to be no more chance of imperialist intervention or capitalist restoration. This is the difference between like Stalin's arguments and the later arguments of like the Khrushchevite revisionists. See, Stalin emphasizes that yes, it's possible for us to build socialism in one country, even surrounded by imperialist countries. Yes, it's possible for us to develop and make great progress towards socialism, but the only thing that does guarantee the Soviet Union against capitalist restoration and against intervention from the imperialists is, of course, the ultimate victory of the proletariats in the imperialist countries. But that doesn't mean that we can't get the communists and in the Soviet Union don't get on and build socialism in these countries, in this country. Why? Because as Stalin emphasized in later interviews with Roy Howard and H.G. Wells, the Soviet Union acting as a center of global revolution what that does is that gives inspiration and impetus to the proletariat in the imperialist countries, and that of course brings on the potential for a revolution there. But it should not be the case, as Trotsky and Zinoviev both say in this debate in 1926, that the Soviet proletariat and peasantry has to be essentially held hostage to the development of revolution in the West. And you notice this in Trotskyite writings over and over again, Trotsky in particular, wailing and rending his clothing over the fact that the German Revolution has failed. Well, you can, wail and rend your clothing about that, but at the same time, you must be prepared to push the revolution forward in the Soviet Union, because not only is it possible to build socialism in the Soviet Union, even when it is surrounded by reactionary countries, but also, as I said, it brings forward the possibility of revolution in those countries, and also the fact that there are communist parties in those countries, and that the most advanced and militant part of the working classes is tied to those communist parties and is prepared to take revolutionary action to defend the Soviet Union. This all aids, in turn, the process of revolution in the USSR itself. And the Trotskyites routinely ignored that. And this is where Trotsky falls into, and Zinoviev and Kamenev, who followed him, there's where they all fall into the trap of essentially just falling back into Menshevism, because the Trotsky's argument about the necessity of a revolution in the West, without which the revolution in the East is finished. This is the same as the Menshevik argument. The Menshevik argument was always that we in Russia are too backward. We cannot possibly have a revolution. We cannot possibly triumph against the imperialists. We must have a development of capitalism first, and only after we've developed capitalism for God knows how many generations will we be able to have an actual socialist revolution, because then only then will the proletariat be strong enough for us to overcome internal reaction and also external reaction. And what the Mensheviks also did was, of course, they wrote off the revolutionary potential of the Soviet peasantry, who when they acted in concert, in alliance with the working class, could push the revolution forward. See, this is why Trotsky never stopped being a Menshevik, because he kept making those arguments, but he would dress them up in ultra-revolutionary language. This is why we go back to one of my favorite phrases of Stalin, which is where he says that the ultra-leftist deviation is ultimately a rightist one. Because what you have with the Trotskyites, always with the Trotskyites, is this ultra-revolutionary phrasing: revolution now, permanent revolution. The revolution must go immediately into a socialist period, and then we must go from there to a global revolution. All of the industrialized countries, the advanced countries, must have a socialist revolution at the same time, otherwise we are nothing. Sounds really revolutionary. In actual fact, it's really reactionary. Because what you need to do is you need to look beyond the words of the Trotskyites into their actual meaning. See, words are, tied to concrete realities. And if your argument as a Trotskyite, and I used to make these arguments, is that Russia is too backward, the Soviet Union is too backward, the imperialists are too powerful. Without a revolution in the imperialist centers, socialism in the Soviet Union is bound to fail. It's too backward. It's too reactionary, etc., etc., etc. The whole question of this is very, very interesting when we consider later on that the whole way in which the revisionists went into the 1950s with Khrushchev and then later with Gorbachev was essentially, again, a return to the old Menshevik arguments, which is that we're too backward, and this was especially true for the Gorbachev period, that we're too backward, we can't possibly succeed, the imperialists are too powerful. And this, again, like this was especially true in the 1980s. So the arguments that we can't actually win that the imperialists are too powerful, that we are too weak, that we must have either a revolution in the West, or we must learn from the West and must go towards the West, go towards the imperialists. Those are arguments that started with the Mensheviks, which were developed later with a lot of revolutionary phraseology by Trotsky, but which partially return with Khrushchev, but then really come back with Gorbachev. See, the consistent line from Menshevism to Trotskyism to Khrushchevite revisionism to Gorbachevism, this is all the same kind of arguments. It is remarkable the similarity that one sees between them over and over and over again. But the central part is the dismissal of the Soviet proletariat and peasantry, and the dismissal of the heroic role of the masses, all of which goes right back to Menshevism and Trotskyism, taken up by Khrushchevite revisionism and brought to its worst and most horrific ends by the Gorbachevites. But this is interesting to read at its sort of at the genesis point of Trotskyism. So we then move on to the final part, which is, I think I'll read this to you in full, because this is very much the point where we're coming to the end of the toleration of Trotsky and Zinoviev and Kamenev in the party. This is the period of the so-called united opposition. Stalin says at the end of his contribution, he makes 8 points, which I will read to you in full. 1. The party cannot and will not tolerate any longer that every time you find yourselves in the minority, you go out into the street, proclaim a crisis in the party, and set up a commotion in it. That the party will not tolerate any longer. 2. The party cannot and will not tolerate that you, having lost hope of securing a majority in our party, rake together and assemble all kinds of disgruntled elements as material for a new party. That the party cannot and will not tolerate. 3. The party cannot and will not tolerate, while defaming the party's directing apparatus and breaking the regime in the party, breaking its iron discipline, you unite all trends condemned by the party and form them into a new party on the plea of freedom of factions. That the party will not tolerate. 4. We know we have great difficulties to contend with in the building of socialism. We see these difficulties and are able to overcome them. We would welcome any assistance from the opposition in overcoming these difficulties, but the party cannot and will not tolerate that you make attempts to exploit these difficulties for undermining our position, for attacks and assaults on the party. 5. The party realizes better than all the oppositionists put together that industrialization can be promoted and socialism completely built only if there is continuous improvement in the material and cultural standards of the working class. The party is adopting and will continue to adopt all possible measures to ensure that the material and cultural standards of the working class continually improve. But the party cannot and will not tolerate that the opposition comes out into the street with demagogic statements calling for an immediate 30 to 40% increase in wages, since it knows for a fact that industry cannot stand such an increase at the present moment. Since it knows for a fact that the purpose of these demagogic pronouncements is not to improve the condition of the working class, but to foment discontent among the backward sections of the working people and to organize discontent against the party, against the vanguard of the working class, that the party cannot and will not tolerate. Point 6. The party cannot and will not tolerate the opposition continues to undermine the foundations of the bond between the workers and the peasants, the foundations of the alliance between the workers and the peasants, carrying on the propaganda for an increase of wholesale prices and heavier taxation of the peasantry, and endeavoring to construct the relations between the proletariat and the peasantry, not as relations of economic cooperation, but as relations of exploitation of the peasantry by the proletarian state. That the party cannot and will not tolerate. Point 7. The party cannot and will not tolerate the oppositionists continuing to spread ideological confusion in the party, to exaggerate our difficulties, to foster a defeatist spirit, to preach the impossibility of completely building socialism in our country, and thereby to undermine the foundations of Leninism. That the party cannot and will not tolerate. 8. The party cannot and will not tolerate, although this is a matter not only for it, but for all sections of the Comintern, that you continue to stir up trouble in the Comintern, to corrupt its sections and discredit its leadership. That the party cannot and will not tolerate. So, the reason why we go into that is that the whole whole 8 points there could easily have been leveled at, well, Khrushchev for a start, but especially at the Gorbachevites, because that's indeed, most of that is indeed what they ended up doing. But to go back to this period in 1926, the reason why this marks the end of Trotsky is because what Stalin does there is he outlines what the Trotskyites have been doing. And by the way, don't just take my word for this. Go and read the works of Ernest Mandel, of Tariq Ali, and others who openly celebrate that this is what Trotsky was doing. He was going around proclaiming that there needed to be a new party formed. There needed to be mass opposition amongst the proletariat to the Soviet system, to the party. And as Stalin points out there, this is what Trotsky has been doing since 1921. We started off this series months ago by looking at the debate over the trade union question, and every time Trotsky lost a vote in the Central Committee, despite the fact he was bound by party discipline, he would go running out into the street and getting his supporters to go and agitate amongst the workers, proclaiming that the party was finished, that it was persecuting the great leader Trotsky, that the great leader needed the support of the workers, that the workers needed to drive the revolution forward, that the alliance with the peasantry needed to be broken. Now Stalin keeps returning to that point because, as Stalin says in this contribution he made, the alliance with the small and poor peasants and the neutralization politically of the middle peasantry, and the alliance of those with the propertyless peasants and the small peasants with the proletariat and against the kulaks and the capitalist elements, that's what was needed to drive the revolution forward. If you destabilize that by jacking up taxation on the smaller peasants and driving them into the hands of the political hands of the kulaks, what you do is essentially you guarantee a situation where there is a breakdown of the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry, which is what the line of the Trotskyites would have done, and therefore it would have finished off any prospect of building socialism. And again, the Trotskyites dressed this up with ultra-revolutionary language, but the practical impact of them, had they succeeded, would have been the annihilation of the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry, and it would have been reduce the country to a state of civil war. Dressed up in revolutionary language, but it would have led to a complete and total disaster. And this is something which, of course, the Trotskyites do not want to address. And what Trotsky is doing up to the point where he's finally expelled from the party and forced into internal exile is he keeps encouraging rebellion against the party. He keeps encouraging factions to be formed and keeps now encouraging the formation of a new party based on his principles to be torn out of the CPSU. And he's going around trying to agitate for that. Note also the section where Stalin talks about making demagogic demands to backward layers of workers. Well, that was what Yeltsin ended up going around doing in the later 1980s, going around demagogically addressing groups of workers in Ukraine and Western Russia in particular, where he would go around and say, we will give you the pay rise that you deserve. We the reformers will give you what these tired old bureaucrats in the CPSU won't give you. You listen to me, you come along with me, lads, I'll sort you out. Of course, he didn't. But the point is that they're going around making demagogic demands, as Stalin points out, this is what the Trotskyites were doing, is only designed to destabilize the situation. Now, is it the case that everybody in the Trotskyite opposition knew that they were destabilizing the country? They were likely to break the alliance with the peasantry, that they would force the Soviet state to try and meet wage demands that it couldn't meet at that time? Well, not all of them would have seen it that way, of course. But the point about this is that just because you do not see something, just because you do not understand what you are doing fully, it doesn't exculpate you from responsibility. We are responsible for our actions as communists in relation to when we are trying to build a party, when we are trying to build a revolution, when we are trying to maintain proletarian power. We are responsible. We should be responsible for our actions, and be aware of the fact that our words and our actions have power amongst the masses, or at least we hope to get to that point. But a figure like Trotsky was either completely unaware of the impact that his actions and his words would have, or he knew the harm that he was causing, and he knew that his words and his actions and his agitation had the potential to reduce the country to a state of civil war and destroy Soviet power, and he pursued this line anyway. So we have to understand that there are fully, as much as we can, the impact of our actions, and also understand what violation of collective discipline means, what trying to encourage the breakdown of the party would mean, what breaking up the alliance with the peasantry would mean. Now, Trotsky wasn't a stupid man. However, he was a wild egomaniac. So in the end, does Trotsky belong in the camp of a straight up traitor, or a misguided egomaniac? In my view, straight up traitor, because at each turn he ran straight towards fragmenting the party and destroying it in terms of its ability to influence the masses. And he kept doing that over and over and over again. And the fact that it took him 6 years to finally get booted out despite repeatedly engaging in this behavior says that the Bolshevik Party at the time, or the CPSU, was a lot more tolerant than Trotsky's followers would have us believe. So, going to pause there and take some questions and comments. Go back to the top here. So, hello to James Graham. Hello to let's go there. Okay. Hello to Slumbering Colossus, Kulak Eradicating Ukro. Hello to Comrade Jawad, Christopher Rogers, Edward, who says, by depoliticizing the party, the bureaucratic wing of the CPSU under Khrushchev laid the groundwork for the inability to resist traitors and pro-capitalist views as Marxism was pushed out. I would say that the biggest damage that revisionism did, there's two things that revisionism does, which damaged the ability of the party to stop the Gorbachevites later on. One was the repeated insistence that socialism had already been reached, and the constant moving of the goalposts there, and also the removal of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the de-emphasis on the need for the continuation of the class struggle against pro-capitalist elements. That those two things together combined sought to depoliticize the proletariat. In the end, it wasn't quite enough to destroy socialism completely. To destroy socialism completely, you still needed to destroy the CPSU, which is what the Gorbachevites did. And they were able to do that because, as we were saying on the episode covering the Chinese documentary on this the other day, they were able to do that because there were too many people with a bureaucratic mentality in the hierarchy of the CPSU who couldn't imagine that the upper reaches of the CPSU had not only fallen into the hands of revisionists, but had fallen into the hands of active traitors. And the inability to see that, and the inability to respond to an emergency situation by taking emergency measures, that is the most damning thing that one can say against the revisionists. It's their fact that they made a situation possible where anti-communists could rise to the top. Not only men who were politically undeveloped, but men who had become anti-communists could become the leaders of a communist party. The fact that that situation developed is directly down to the moves made by Khrushchev, moves which originate with Trotsky. Hello to Anthony in Prague, Jerry, Roberto, who joins us from Mexico, Tim Gray, David Ball, Svetlana from Moscow, hello to you, Enigma. RVA Klavek joining us from Detroit. Jenny, hello to you. Molotov Cocktail enjoyed the first part of the Chinese documentary. Good to hear. Abtin, hello to you. Slumbering Colossus. Alistair Page McGill. Albert, hello to you. James, he says the uses of the pejorative tankies to describe anti-revisionist is ironic considering its origin. Well, I'm proud to be called one now because the tanks of 1956 in Hungary crushed a fascist uprising and counter-revolution. So, yeah, and also the proletariat should have a fleet of tanks at its disposal. Right. Hello to you, Wan, Grassy Knoll, Caustic Grip. T.G. Wilson points out the British Army maintained a substantial presence in Ireland during the 1840s. Also, 20 to 30,000 troops used to ensure food exports continued, whereas the Irish starved to death. Very good point. Ireland was as exploited and abused as any colony, and was quite literally starved to death at gunpoint, and subject to forced migration at gunpoint. Hello to Comrade Ian Foster. Molotov Cocktail says that the British state was preparing for a war in the near future. They would try to increase the general fitness of the population. Well, I don't think they're going to go to war in the near future. They just don't have the capacity to do it, basically. But you are correct in what you say there. Alexander Lukter says, fun fact, the last Confederate general to surrender during the Civil War was Standvati, a Cherokee who were one of the 5 civilized tribes who tried to adapt to white civilization. Hint, for the most part, it didn't make them equal. It never did. Nehat said it's remarkable in the Russian Revolution how they were completely able to get rid of feudalism. Changing feudalism to citizenship is in itself very important. Good point. Grassy Knoll says in 1938 the US Army still had horses and the new recruits were trained with wooden guns without bullets. Very interesting. But yes, the American and the British bourgeois were actually quite cautious when it comes to standing armies for a very long time. Okay, so yes, Molotov Cocktail says Article 6. Yes, the fact that they place such a great emphasis on the need to do away with Article 6 shows us that there was still potential oppositional sources within the CPSU back in the 1980s, which is why the CPSU had to be thrown out of power by its own general secretary and destroyed completely. That's something that they very much prioritized. So, okay, that brings us to the conclusion of this episode of the Stalin series. Another episode to come next week. Details to be posted up on Telegram and on Twitter. I'll say thanks to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. But until then, thank you for tuning in and good night.